Hello, and welcome to episode 5.
Woo, we made it to 5.
We made it to 5. Now it's established. There's no going back.
And we've got product placement for episode 5. If you know anyone from Coke, send the Diet Coke my way.
Yeah, right now it's a free sponsorship.
That's right. That's right.
For those of you that don't know, this is our follow-up podcast to Messages on Sunday mornings. So every Sunday we gather, we hear a message, we hear a speaker, and then we use this podcast as a way to dive deeper, to unpack, to answer questions, the questions that you submit. You can submit those in the mobile app. There's actually 2 ways to do it now. I added another way.
Oh, wow.
So you can do it in the This Week's Talk notes. If you scroll all the way down to the bottom, there's a button. And then also just on the home screen of the app, there's an additional little submit a question box. So It should be really easy to find. So keep submitting questions. We love going through those.
They're fun.
They're a blast. So I'm one of your hosts, Mark Adkins. To my left is Rick Rubel.
Yes.
Rick, we are in a new-ish series called Sticky Notes.
Yep.
And Jake kicked us off last week with Philemon, or Philemon as I like to call him. And this week you took us through, out of order, you jumped into 3 John.
Yep.
Or 3 John.
3 John.
So if you could, just give a Sticky Notes version, an even more abbreviated version of what is John talking about in 3 John.
So Sticky Notes are all we've done a 4-week series. It's the 4 shortest books in the New Testament.
Yep.
3 John, probably the verse that just capsulizes everything, and I didn't say this in the message, is actually verse 11 that says, "Dear friend, don't imitate what's evil, but imitate what's good." Anyone who does what's good's from God. Anybody who does what's evil's not from God. And so it's a letter from John to his friend Gaius, who has extended hospitality to teachers and preachers that traveled and taught the truth of God to believers. So it's a letter to Gaius, and it affirms him in some really cool ways, and then it gives a warning about this guy named Diatrophies, who's controlling, likes to be first, that kind of thing. And then at the end, it commends a guy named Demetrius, who was the person who probably delivered the letter. So it's really short, 14 verses, something like that.
Yeah.
But something really cool there.
Yeah, great. And so and you kind of unpacked it a little bit there. In John's letter, you kind of get this, some people call it the sandwich technique. You called it the Oreo technique, which someone had an issue with. But basically, the concept of starts with a good encouragement, goes to a warning, ends with an encouragement. So you kind of get this sandwich effect or the Oreo effect, which brings us to our first question.
Someone likes Oreos or something.
This person, and it's signed at the end, so we'll get to who sent it. You did an analogy where the center of the Oreo was the bad part and the cookies were the good part. Have you ever eaten an Oreo? The cream is obviously the best part. Signed, the Cookie Monster.
I actually should have done product placement with Oreo cookies, because I will say this: I have celiac, and there are gluten-free Oreos. And the double stuff Oreos are like the best. So yes, I get that, Cookie Monster. The center is the best in an Oreo cookie. But then if you call it the sandwich technique, then you have to say the meat's the bad part. It's
you just can't win.
That's right.
So you heard it here first. You heard it here first on Northpointe Plus. Rick is repenting of his Oreo analogy.
That's correct. Absolutely.
And then another part that you mentioned in John's letter is this emphasis on hospitality in the church. And you shared your own part of your own story where you mentioned that you've stayed in probably over 350 homes, which is like blows my mind that I don't even think I've seen 350 homes in my life, let alone been near them and stayed in them.
I have, this is not the place, but I have incredible stories about the places that I've stayed.
I'm sure.
Stayed in some wonderful, wonderful homes and stayed in some ones that the night was long because they were maybe not quite as nice. When I was in college, I traveled in a group that sang in a different church every night.
Yeah.
And we would leave in May and come back at the very end of August, right before school started.
Yeah.
90 nights on the road, every night staying in somebody else's home.
Jeez.
And so people have asked a lot of times, how is it that you're so good with names? Well, when you wake up someplace and you think, what is the name of the people that are fixing me breakfast? I haven't any idea. I learned some techniques to help that process. But so 2 summers, it was 90 days each summer that I was in different people's homes. 2 years, I traveled 14 weekends a semester, so about 28 weekends each year, staying in people's homes, and then beyond that, once I grew up and began to direct choirs and went on tour, and as well as choir tours when I was in college.
Sure,
stayed in lots of homes.
I can only imagine. And part of what you talked about in your message is this, and what we've talked about outside of that is, John has this very clear emphasis on hospitality.
Yeah.
It's almost an expectation in the church that they are to be hospitable.
Yeah.
And how little we hear of that nowadays.
And not just John. Paul, when he writes to Timothy, uses that, and this is a big deal for the elders in the church who are like the most mature spiritually, that hospitality would be a hallmark for them. It's a big deal, and that's not something in American culture that we've cultivated at all. And I think biblically, that's something that we need to. One of the other examples where, to me, that just really sticks out. I said in the message, there were some times that I stayed in people's homes that they gave up their beds for us, and that was pretty humbling. But on mission trips, more than one time, people would spend a week's worth of their wages to fix us a meal. And so it was a challenge with the groups that I led to say to people, man, whatever you're served, you eat as a guest, because they are giving their very best, even though that may not be what you would choose to eat.
Right.
They have sacrificed immensely for you, and that's that whole spirit of hospitality.
Yeah. We lose a lot of the concept of even what that cost means, in the American culture, just because to give up a week's worth of anything is almost like a laughable idea for us.
Why would you do that?
Yeah. So I wanted to dive into a few questions. So I have a few questions. We have some questions that were submitted, and so
let me just say this. Because I can, and we're on tape. We're not going 41 minutes like Jake last week.
Now my goal is to go 42 minutes. I'm going to hold you here.
Jake was okay. Yeah.
So you pointed out early on the key players in John's letter, and it's pretty clear. I mean, John writes the letter and addresses it to one person.
Yeah.
So I guess one question off the bat is, how do we as a church, thousands of years later, read and apply a letter that was meant and directed towards one person? Is it applicable to us? Does it still apply? How do we know if it applies?
Yeah, I one of the big picture things about Northpointe and about, for me personally, I think that you look at what Scripture says, look at the Scripture that we have, and trust that is God's word given to us for a purpose, and that's been vetted over now 2,000 years in terms of the New Testament.
Yeah.
But the process that happened in the first century and beyond that, where the letters were validated, the biographies of Jesus were vetted and validated and said, these are true and accepted by the church. They were circulated among the churches. Yeah. And so the truth that's there, that as John writes to Gaius, those lessons that he's trying to convey, those are principles that apply to us. So when you see what John said to Gaius, what John said about Demetrius, what John said about Diatrophies, there's clear application for us now, even in 2021.
Great. We have a question from Kate.
Yeah.
And this is great. So there's one point in the message in John's letter where he says, I have more stuff to say to you, but I want to do it in person. I want to do it face to face, and kind of drawing that principle of there's conversations that can be had through letter. For John, through us, it might be through text, email, over Zoom, virtually, whatever it might be. And there's conversations that should happen in person. Right. And the story that I always like to use is, I won't name the person in my life because they might listen to this, but there's a person close to me in my life who was broken up with, not through text, but had their mom call him.
Oh my.
And that was the breakup initiation. So some conversations are so important that you should not have your mom have them for you.
Yes.
So Kate asked the question, when it comes to those conversations and for how to discern, how do we know which of those conversations should be face-to-face versus through text or email or through my mom calling that person?
Kudos to Kate for asking that question, because it's just a tiny piece at the very end of the letter, kind of a throwaway thing from John.
Yeah.
But I think that's really true. And I would say any conversation that makes your hands sweaty, when you think about it, any conversation that you think, oh, this could be misinterpreted, any conversation that's about an issue that the other person has deep feelings about, any conversation that is going to have long-term implications. I think it's always right to think, can I have this conversation in person rather than electronically, particularly email or text? Yeah, it's harder. In my mind, it really always is. I can communicate a lot of things to a lot of people really quickly through email or text. That's great. But if there's a harder conversation, a conversation about conflict, a conversation about difference of opinion, that kind of thing, a conversation about even difficult things that are going on in somebody's life, I want to. The next step up is to have it as a phone conversation, and it's even better to be able to do that face to face. So if it's one of those conversations that is difficult or that you anticipate could be misunderstood, that you want to go face to face on that. My dad, I can remember my dad saying all the time, I can get in enough trouble doing the right thing. I don't have to try and do the wrong thing. And I think that applies to this concept in that. I can send off an email really quickly, and that be misunderstood, and so I just have to be sensitive about how I communicate.
Yeah, and I think for me, I won't speak for everyone. I know for me, my gut check is almost always, if I would prefer to not have the conversation in person, that's usually the conversation I have to have in person.
That's right. That's a great standard.
If my default is I really just want to send a text and be done, it's almost always better to just talk with that person. Yeah,
and oftentimes when I talk about it with the staff at Northpointe, if it goes email, response, at that point it's like no more email. Have the see the person, set it up, have the conversation face to face, because the more the more in the weeds you get, the more misunderstood you can be.
Yeah, that's a great principle. So I kind of want to shift somewhat in tone to Diatrophies. And so you would kind of unpacked in this letter, John identifies Diatrophies as this basically an evil leader, someone who is in leadership that really shouldn't be in leadership, is abusing his leadership. And so my mind immediately goes to, okay, thank God at Northpointe we don't have that.
Right.
How do we ensure that we don't have that in our leadership? What checks and balances? What's in place? How do we know that I don't rise to power to the Diatrophies?
You know, it was really funny because when I was preaching yesterday and I asked that question, the real question is not, who do you know that's a Diatrophies? The question is, am I a Diatrophies? I could see people's eyes were like, oh, is Rick Diatrophies? And it was that connection. So it's a legitimate question for all of us to ask that question.
Yeah.
Do I have those qualities in me? At Northpointe, we have what I think is a very biblical model of church leadership, what's called polity, in that we have a group of elders that I'm accountable to. And so if I start to teach things that shouldn't be taught, if I'm acting in a way that doesn't honor Jesus, the elders are going to call me into accountability. The church is the person, are the people that affirm the elders who are selected. And so there is that sense of accountability to the elders, to the body, as well as to Jesus. And for our staff, the staff's accountable to their direct reports accountable to me. So that the real issue with Diatrophies is that he said, I'm large and in charge. I'm not listening to anybody. And to have at Northpointe, everybody has people that they're accountable to. And we take that real seriously.
Yeah, and it's such an important issue, which brings me to the next area I want to dive a little more into is this idea of identifying a Diatrophies, because I'm sure as you were even speaking, you kind of mentioned people's eyes widening, and I'm sure I know even for myself, you kind of instinctively think of like, oh, I know that person. I know this person in my life,
Right.
and I disagree with them, and I don't like them, and are they the Diatrophies of my life? And so I want to kind of unpack, how do we properly identify who the Diatrophies is in our life, in ourself, and kind of speaking to you had brought up, Henry Cloud had this concept of the wise person, the foolish person, and the evil person.
Right.
And how do we avoid labeling someone Diatrophies when they're not evil, they're just foolish, or we disagree with them, or we just don't get along with them?
Yeah, I think Diatrophies, evilness, if you want to call it that, had to do with how he dealt with the people who were, in a sense, kind of underneath him, the people that he was responsible to lead, and the lack of people that he was willing to submit to and to listen to. And so anytime that anyone is in a place where they don't have accountability above them that they listen to, and that they really have the ability to draw the reins in on them and to say, man, you've crossed a line, or you're getting really close to a line, that's a dangerous issue. When I think about the people that were in my mind when I was talking in the message about that have been very public in terms of their abuse of power and fall, they have all had some level of accountability that they've just kind of thumbed their nose at and said, you know what, you can say what you want, I'm going to do what I want. And that is not what it means to follow Jesus.
Yeah, that's crucial. And I think for identifying it in ourselves, for me, it's always been the idea of feedback, which I think you had touched on. I think Henry Cloud's idea touched on that. Like, if someone is giving you feedback, a wise person takes feedback, accepts that, wants that to be a part of their life.
It may not be fun.
No.
But they listen and they get it, and they implement the things that need to make change.
Yeah, and they have an understanding of the value of that. And the foolish person might allow feedback, but is not going to accept it, isn't really going to take it. And the foolish person avoids it altogether.
Right.
You're not allowed to give me feedback.
Right.
So I think that's the gut check in our own lives is like, where am I at on that scale of, sometimes it depends on who's giving me feedback or whatever it might be. But I think that should convict us in some way of trying to identify where we're at in the scale.
And I don't want to jump into Cloud's stuff too deeply, but let me just say this, because I think it's really helpful if you're watching. That the foolish segment are people that they get feedback and they won't take responsibility for their part in that. And that's a real challenge. It's easy to blame circumstances, to blame people, to blame anything except to take responsibility for yourself. One of the things I've said with the staff a number of times is anytime that there's negative feedback that comes to us in the church, the first question to really ask is, where is there truth in what has been communicated to us? Because it doesn't matter if it's brought to us in a mean, spiteful way, or whatever. If there's truth there, we need to be sensitive to know that God may be using that conflict, that feedback that we're getting, to draw us back to Him in a way that honors Him.
Yeah. Yep. Love that.
Don't be foolish. Be wise.
Don't be foolish.
Don't be evil.
Definitely don't be evil.
Yeah.
And so this will be the last question that I have, is kind of walking through removing evil people from your life. And actually, maybe my question ties into, we got an anonymous question that I think actually ties into this really well. The question that they submitted was, what advice would you give for someone who is stuck in the place of submission to a Diatrophies at home, at work, in the government, wherever it might be, like wherever you might identify a true Diatrophies? So not just someone that you don't like, not just someone you disagree with, not just someone that you don't get along with, but a truly evil person. What advice do we give for someone that's stuck under that?
Those segments are interesting segments.
Yes.
I think in every situation, the starting place is to pray for Diatrophies. To just say, God, I need you to help me walk through this. I need you to help me respond in the right way. I need you to help me see with clarity what the situation is. I would say if you're in a situation at work with Diatrophies, with a Diatrophies boss, an option is to say, you know what, it's not safe for me to operate, to continue with that in that kind of situation. I also think it's a legitimate place to say, you know what, God, there's some things that you want to teach me through this process. I'm going to stick it out because at some point in time, God is going to call Diatrophies, a person who acts like Diatrophies, on the carpet, and there's going to be some level of responsibility that they take. They usually implode. They usually cause that destruction that we talked about. And so I think that you can take a posture to say, I'm going to stick it out. I'm going to be faithful where I am as long as God allows me to. I think that's an option. I think in terms of the government realm, I think you look at that in terms of, okay, what are the biblical principles that apply in that area of our life. And I think when you look at Romans, at 1 Peter 3, we're called to obey the government and to be, as followers of Jesus, the best citizens in the country, regardless. I mean, that instruction came when there was a very corrupt and a very corrupt government that was violently opposed to those who follow Jesus. And both Peter and Paul say, you know what? No, God put them in charge for a reason, even in their sinfulness. And so need to be faithful to God in that process and to recognize that there's going to be a cost that comes in that. I think the harder realm that you talked about is, okay, what happens if you have a Diatrophies at home? And I think that just for clarity, if it is a situation where you're unsafe, where physically there are issues there, I think that's one of the things that you reach out and say, I've got to have help. I've got to get out of this situation because of the physical threat that's there. I think that minus that, it's a real challenge again to pray and say, God, what do you want me to do in this? And how do you want me to respond? And to just follow where He leads in that. I think if you're brought into contact with Diatrophies, with a Diatrophies in your life, the only people who can really help in that are people who have a relationship. And that's even hard because their nature is that they're in control and that they won't listen to anybody else.
Right.
But if you have a place to be able to speak into their life, we need to do that as followers of Jesus because we're warning them of their impending destruction because it's going to happen. Right. What you sow, you're going to reap. Biblical truth.
Yeah, and that's what I think is clear. As some instruction from John's letter is that John interacted with Diatrophies.
John says, I'm gonna come call him on the carpet. I'm gonna come talk to him and straighten him out.
Right. And that comes from, John has had previous interactions. Like this is an ongoing thing where it's not that John just heard of Diatrophies and was like, the dude's evil. Right. Like John has had some sort of relationship. We're not given full clarity on what that looks like, but it's had some sort of opportunity for Diatrophies to refuse instruction, to refuse accountability continually. And so John is at that point where he arrives to the conclusion of Diatrophies is someone that needs to be called out, needs to be held accountable. And that can look different at home, at work, in the government, in the church.
And I think that there is, when you look at all of Scripture, you say, okay, what's John's interaction with Diatrophies, what's that going to be? And I think it makes sense when you look at the principles that are involved that Diatrophies is probably going to be removed from his leadership position. Not probably. He is going to be removed from his leadership position. But the goal of that is to protect the body that he's been leading and to call Diatrophies to repentance, to bring him back into the right kind of relationship with Jesus.
Yep.
And John was unique in his position as one of the 12, as the elder that he describes himself as, to be able to do that. And that even though John was known for his loving pastoral nature, the most loving and pastoral thing he could do would be to remove Diatrophies for the sake of the people that he's been leading.
Yeah, I think that's great. That should help us, I think, because my concern is we love labels in our culture, and it's so easy to just label someone as, you're the evil person in my life, you're the Diatrophies.
Right.
And to know that that's not a label that John throws around, that's not a label that the other authors in the Bible throw around, that it's just this willy-nilly, like, there's people are evil, we'll kick them out of the church, whatever. That is a label that is arrived at with a lot of prayer and consideration and relationship and the push and the pull and the uncomfortable process that comes with all of that. And you can hear it in John's letter that it's not like a fun thing that John just labels people as Diatrophies.
Right.
But like you said, having that love and care for the church, that same love and care for Diatrophies and for his soul and caring for that is, I think, very clearly evident and not something that we should just
let me say label. One other thing we that we haven't really talked about in this, and I didn't talk about it yesterday. It's interesting to me that one of the descriptors of Diatrophies is that he spreads malicious reports about us to the people. And the reason I point that out is to say, if you're in a place where, as a follower of Jesus, other people are spreading untrue things about you, know that God has not forgotten you, and that He's not that's not going on in anonymity, and that you're just going to have to deal with that forever. You may have to deal with that for the rest of your life, but God knows it. John knew it. He knew that Diatrophies was trying to cut his legs out from underneath him, and John was going to deal with that. But we are not promised a bed of roses. We're not promised an easy life as followers of Jesus, nor as Christian leaders.
Yeah.
And just know that you're not alone in that.
Yeah, that's great. Those are the questions that I have.
Good.
I think it's a lot to chew on. It's a great content. 3rd John is not a long book, so dive back into it. Keep reading it. There's a lot to uncover in 3rd John. So, anything else on your end?
Nope.
I think we got it
Sounds
covered.
Great. Thanks.
Awesome.
Thanks for watching.
Yes, thanks for tuning in. Keep submitting your questions, and we will see you next week.
Share and like.
Share, like, subscribe, do all of that. Yes, keep doing that, and we'll see you next week.